Awesome. Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. We're going to start in a couple of minutes to give everyone a chance to join. And yeah, as the numbers are increasing in the attendees, I'm excited that everyone's able to join us for our last webinar in this series. So bear with us for a couple of minutes. Thank you. Jeremiah, did you have a question?
No, just to trying to connect it. How are you again? This is Jeremiah. I don't have any question, my dear. But nice to join you. And my name is Jeremiah, the Managing Director of DRS Disability Research Tanzania, based in Kigoma, working in the refugees and the host community to support persons with specific needs.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining, Jeremiah.
Thank you very much, madam.
Okay. I think we're going to go ahead and start, and hopefully others can join us soon. We are recording today as well, so hopefully anyone who may miss the webinar will be able to watch the recording on our YouTube channel later on. So again, welcome everyone. My name is Mariam. Welcome to our third and final Disability Inclusion in ICT webinar in this series. For this year anyway. We might come back next year. I'm wearing a cream scarf today, and I identify as a brown woman. The title of today's webinar is Making Sustainable Change Towards Disability Inclusive ICT. We are delighted to host the Disability Inclusion in ICT Webinar Series as part of the wider project focusing on project engagement for ICT. The project focuses on promoting meaningful participation and leadership by disabled people in ICT education, research, and innovation. The project is led by our academic director, Professor Kathy Holloway, and myself, and is funded by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, EPSRC. We've had 2 webinars so far, and today is our third and final webinar. We've discussed different topics from barriers, first defining what disability inclusion in ICT means, and then discussing the barriers. And now today we're going to talk about this: how do we make sustainable change to make ICT disability inclusive? We will post the link to our website and our project in the chat, so feel free to browse the website and explore the different content. And we will also post the link to our YouTube channel, so please do subscribe, and so that you can be notified of our upcoming videos on the channel. So in today's webinar, we will hear from 4 of our colleagues on the Inclusive ICT Research Panel, followed by Q&A. We'll do our best to go through all the questions in the Zoom Q&A feature. So please do use that to add your questions. But if by any chance we are unable to answer your questions today, we will follow up with answering questions in a blog post on our website. So please do ask questions, and we will do our best to answer as soon as possible. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce you to our first speaker, Yahya Siad. Yahya is a former Paralympic athlete. He represented the Great Britain squad in goalball sport. Yahya is the writer and author of his autobiography, The Unshakable Will. He's the founder of Inclusive Horizons, that's inclusivehorizons.com, a self-led self-advocacy service in the realm of accessibility, inclusion, and inspiration coaching. Yahya has 14 years of experience in the UK and in the UAE in the fields of social experience enterprises, commercial media, banking, and digital transformation. Currently, among several roles, he is the diversity and accessibility lead at CyberDuck. He holds a master's degree in international HR management from Westminster University in London with a focus on diversity and inclusion training. He's also a certified professional co-active coach. So over to you, Yahya. Welcome.
Hello, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mariam, for the kind introduction, and welcome all of you who joined us today. My name is Yahya, and I identify myself as a dark brown, and I'm wearing a stripy shirt with black jacket. I hope that gave a good description. If you could see me, I'm sorry. If you cannot see me, you're not missing out on much. But on a more serious note, in terms of our topic for today, just as a caveat to start with, really, I'm going to be covering this topic, sustainable change in disability inclusion and ICT, mainly from a consultancy background, because that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. It won't be so much focused on the academia sphere, so to speak. So I wanna answer the question really with four different elements that could help us to sustain the change in disability inclusion and ICT. So the first one will be around, it will be from extreme use to mainstream use, and I'll explain that, what does that mean later on. And then the other thing will be about regulations and policies, and then organization and industry leaders. And then the last thing is early education and professional certifications. So to start with, I think one thing we could do immediately, and I think is already taking momentum, and I feel is really key in terms of sustaining the change, is to move from the concept of extreme users to mainstream users. At the moment, disability is seen as a extreme users, or at least it's classified. If you look at the famous design thinking paradigm, which is developed by Nelson Norman, and it talks about 5 different elements of design thinking, starting from empathizing, ideating, defining, prototyping, and testing. None of those definitions of the disability in that design thinking talks about disability or refers to it. It refers to something called extreme users. And I think we've all been highlighting in the last webinars that, you know, at minimum 15% of the world population have live some form of disability, not to mention the temporary situational disabilities, if you can call it that way, or limitations of some sorts, and not to mention the aging and you know, the illness that easily could take us up more than to 50%, I would say. So that really forces us to move from that. So what does that mean really in practice? A lot of these products that people with disability use tend to be highly specialized product, very expensive, difficult to scale. And we know that, you know, majority of people live with disability are in the global south, or the countries with low and middle income countries. And that really is not, that's something we need to move on from. I think every organization, every product need to mandate on itself that what they have to offer is able to use by people with disability. So we're able to move from those expensive products. You know, for example, you look at the screen reader that we all use. Typically, you know, specialized product for that will be the use of JAWS, which is very expensive. But an alternative for that is the NVDA, which a lot of people with visual impairment use, and it's free of charge. So I would love to see more move from that. I don't want to be using talking microwave. I don't want to be using talking watch. I want to be using a regular watch that can has a speech on it, so to speak. So that's really important. So I think when we're talking about also about open source, one solution could help with that. So a lot of these softwares these days are developed with open source kind of ideas, where there's a lot of emphasis on collaborations. Everybody can add, everybody can amend, you can customize it into different market, etc., etc. So I think the more use of also open source we can do in the development, in the design and development, the better, more scalable, sustainable products for people with disability we can find that can be used by everybody else. And another concept I think is always get unfortunately ignored or not considered properly is the concept of universal design. We're all familiar with that, I think, and if you're not familiar with it, maybe perhaps look at it in your own time. But it has seven different principles, and I will just talk about the first three principles, which is flexibility in use, equitable in use, and simplicity and intuitiveness. If I talk about the daily products that I use on a regular basis, such as going to a shop and trying to do the self-checkout, I'm confronted as a blind person with the touch screens that I cannot use, even though they have a speech features on it. When you put the product, it says, I don't know, payment accepted, or next, do you have more time, etc. So it does have the functionality or technology to talk to you, but it does not have the ability to use it if you don't have a site. So I think I would love to see more understanding or more emphasis on when we're designing this product. Is this product I'm designing intuitive? Is it simple? Is it equitable, etc., etc.? So these things will help us to move really from again designing with specialities in mind. I will move to the next point for the interest of time about regulations and policies. We, at least in Europe and America and Australia, we have a lot of regulations that sort of support accessibility, but a lot of them are, in my opinion, are very timid and do not go far enough. In the UK, we have the Equality Act, we have the public sector bodies, but we don't have something that goes beyond the mobile, goes beyond the apps and websites, and that to me is a problem. So I think the closest one now we have is the European Accessibility Act, which again, people on their own time they can look at it, but it forces or mandates organizations to make sure that their wide range of products, which includes what we call the phygital, which is the combination of digital and physical, ATMs, machines, ticket machines, so many things that must be accessible. And they have until 2025 to make sure that beyond that, June 2025, it will be enforced and penalties will take place. Yes, again, as usual, there's a caveat in the Article 32, especially of this act. There's a lot of exceptions, but at least, in my opinion, this is the most audacious, courageous, general accessibility act we have that could really be a game changer. It could be a game changer, in my opinion, because similar to how the Data Protection Act started, all these years ago from Europe, and it became mandate for all different organizations around the world. And also, one of the good things that excites me about European Accessibility Act is that even if you are, let's say, an organization or company based in Nigeria or Brazil or China, for example, and you have no presence or office in Europe, but you have customers in Europe, you are still bound by this act. So have a look at it. I think it's quite audacious, and my optimistic part of me is telling me that it's going to be a game changer that help us to sustain the change. I'm going to move to organization and industry leaders, which is my third point about the sustainable change. One, again, very non-encouraging facts. If you look at one of the top 100 FTSEs around the world, only 4% of them have an explicit disability accessibility agenda as a part of their diversity and inclusion. This is very scary reality, because if this is the case with the top 100, what we're going to do with other organizations who are like non-for-profit, or government organizations. That need to change. That should not be good enough anymore. And I think we need to make sure this get really highlighted and accountability takes place, because we will keep having lip service into organizations. So I think those industry leaders have really a huge role to play in this change. This G3 is an organization, it's an advocacy platform called G3 as part of the United Nations that does a lot of things about ICT. And in their report of 2021, they said that accessibility does not have a home in organizations. So they surveyed like thousands of organizations and many employees within these organizations, and they realized that accessibility suffers from something called homelessness. It does not have a centralized department that leads its initiatives. So sometimes you see it within HR, sometimes they saw it within CX, which is customer service, sometimes they saw it within UX and design, sometimes they saw it within IT. So you keep floating from one place to another. As a result of this homelessness, there's no budget allocated for it. And as the old adage says, what cannot be measured cannot be done. So I want to emphasize the importance of this as a point for a change to take place. And another one that could help with, I think, the change is the procurement, the policy of procurement. If you are an organization that's serious about accessibility, make sure that your suppliers become also serious about accessibility by factoring a robust system in the bidding process for them to be accepted to be one of your suppliers. And the accessibility has to be one of those things. In that way, we will see a huge change with the stakeholders, products, services, making sure that it become accessible, because they know that without accessibility considerations, they're not gonna win the bid for the contract. And last thing I'm gonna move into is the early education and professional certifications. So I have for those people who know me, I have a 6-year-old daughter who I'm very, very close to. Her name is Mariam. So she's in year 2, which has been grade 2 now in the primary school. So we often talk about, disability and a lot of different topics, just because obviously being the fact that I'm blind myself. So one day she came to me and said, "Oh, Daddy, this morning we learned about somebody on a wheelchair." I was like, "Oh, wow, that's interesting. They're already teaching about disability at like from year 2. And I said, "What did you learn about it?" He said, "Oh, it was a poor guy in a wheelchair, and we were learning about the empathy and not bullying each other. And we learned not to bully people with disability." And I thought, this is the biggest part of the problem, that it starts with everything else. If our education of disability is limited from early age to that, if these people are as an oppressed group, when we grow up, we will have more problems in life in terms of our attitude toward disability. When you move across the grades in educations, you realize that disability is taught as a standalone subject. Same as in the design thinking, is not taught as a standard part of the experience or part of the society. So we teach it as an extra curriculum, as something in itself. You need to specialize in it in order for it in order to understand disability, and that must change. That really must change. Another example, again with my daughter, we often play. We often do like a role play on the weekend or evenings, about different things. So one of the role plays we do is, she works in a restaurant, and I am a customer. So I come to her, hi, how are you? I'm good, yeah. Can I order this? Yeah, okay. What do you have today? We have this, we have that. Then when I finish the experience of eating in her restaurant, I tell her, how much is it then? She says, oh, it's for blind people, it's free. We don't charge blind people. And I thought, why did she say that? Like, I never taught her that. when I looked at what she looked at and what she's been hearing is that people with disability need help. People with disability, you know, it derives again from the same example of that character of a wheelchair user being bullied by his classmates. So our education, I think, need to fundamentally change. It need to really understand that disability is not just a oppressed group, and it's a group that looking for freebies, so to speak. And the last point about professional certification that I want to talk about is, if you are now graduating in any design or development or anything else, you will have to go through certification, of course, and then you do exams in 1, 2, 3 points. None of those design curriculum or development program, as far as I'm aware, has an explicit accessibility factoring into it. In another word, that just like how you learn about the principles of development, design, product management, project cycle, all that stuff, there is nothing specifically about accessibility considerations, which, in my opinion, it creates another problem in itself that makes us always, well, call it firefight with accessibility. We go to accessibility because we realize a problem and then we need to fix it. It's a problem, we need to fix it. And that mindset needs to change. So with that in mind, what I really want to conclude with is a statement. Last week, Ben, I think, shared a really interesting statement that resonated with me. He learned it from his Twitter community, which mentioned something along the line of, you know, accessibility, or when you don't do accessibility, you're cutting corners in your job. One thing I learned from my LinkedIn community last week is that accessibility is not a problem to be solved, but it's a culture to be built. And with that kind of mindset, we were really gonna come to genuine understanding and conclusion that it's something that I need to embed it from early age, all the way to organization sort of budget that helps to make the change possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, indeed. A very insightful points and thoughts about disability culture and how in general in ICT, but also wider culture around disability, and the fact that it's not normalized and we still tiptoe around different topics is why it's not mainstream and the discussions are not happening mainstream. And young children, definitely, as a mother, I can attest that they're very receptive. So that's the starting point where we need to start normalizing these conversations so that the next generation, you know, grows to be okay with it and comfortable with having these discussions. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing your experience. With that, we're going to quickly move on to our next speaker. Oladi Hubo Idris Olalir is a trained, I'm so sorry if I mispronounce your name, we call him Ladi, so we're just going to call him Ladi, is a trained medical doctor with 4+ years of experience, clinical experience, and an MSc in Disability Design and Innovation. He's particularly interested in ensuring universal health coverage and has engaged with voluntary service and international NGOs. In the last 2 years, Ladi has worked as a clinical research manager, during which he designed and conducted several inclusive research within the healthcare space. Over to you, Ladi. Thank you for joining.
Oh, thank you, Maria. Can you hear me clearly?
We can hear you, yes.
Yes. I think I'll start by a quick description of myself. I'm a Black man with black hair, scanty facial hair, and currently wearing a gray jumper. Over the past 2 weeks, we've talked a lot about disability inclusion in ICT research and innovation. We've also gone on to break down some of the barriers associated with disability inclusion. Just to talk generally about how to make sustainable changes, in disability inclusion. Again, I would really like to appreciate Yaya with what he just said, and most of what he said are things that I personally agree with. So for the sake of time, I'll just go on to point out some of the few additions I'd like to add to what is said. Again, we'll be discussing this based on who needs to be involved in these changes, what changes needs to be made, and how are we to ensure that these changes are sustainable. So primarily, it is generally acknowledged that issues around disability should be led by disabled people or the disabled community. So we ensure that the first person in this space that should be involved in disability inclusive ICT research are the disabled community. However, we are also aware that about 85% of disabled people live in the global south, where access to primary, secondary education is I mean, it's what it is. So waiting for such people to come on and lead research or innovation may be a problem where we would probably have very little people capable of leading such cause. So it's important that we also acknowledge that the idea of leading research doesn't necessarily have to be physical. Secondary data are available for reasons like this, where a researcher who doesn't identify as a disabled person is able to actually learn from secondary data available to them and engage with the disabled community to sort of prioritize problems and design a process that is inclusive for everyone. Also, every other member of the community should be involved in fostering disability inclusive research. I'm coming from the perspective of a researcher, and the truth is, you look at funding bodies, research funding bodies. There's increasing desire to make research inclusive and also involving of the general public. So I'd like for us to take this a bit further to say every research has to, again, disabled community makes about 15% of the world's population. So it's just fair, for every application to demonstrate how their project or their outcome would impact the life of the few 15% of the people that would use that. So it's important to actually ensure that we demonstrate that involvement and engagement of the disabled community even before getting the grant for this topic. Again, the regulatory body is another aspect that I think doesn't get enough engagement when you talk about inclusion. To get ethics approval to get ethics approval for research, could be hectic, at some point, and this is just because there's a structure that you have to abide by for you to get this approval. So making this more flexible so that people are able to apply, or even giving the research team the flexibility of saying, well, you need to meet this minimum standard, but we also allow this level of flexibility in your work should you need to make adjustment based on your participants' request or need. That is something that we need to look at from the regulatory body. The issue of data sharing, is something that is, very, very technical, where I work in a university, and many universities have actually designed a platform where if you're taking an online survey, for instance, that is what you have to use, regardless of whether it's accessible to your participants or not, because they've gone on to put in the extra work to ensure that data is well protected in that space. Again, so if I meet someone who, for some reason, is unable to access that space and maybe can only work on Zoom or WhatsApp, how flexible is my project that I'm able to really engage these people? So we need to actually look at the flexibility that comes with the regulatory body, the funding body, and the research team themselves. I'll move on to what needs to change, to make ICT research disability inclusive. As Yaya said earlier, the perception of the disabled community is a problem. You can't really talk about disability inclusion without talking about perception. So I think it's important that we actually try to correct that misconception. As it is almost anywhere in the world, the disabled community are perceived as burden. So it's about, we need to spend extra money to engage them. As a researcher, it may be cheaper, to actually conduct a study that excludes the disabled community in the short term, than involve them. So we need to actually be able to change that perception of looking down at the disabled community. And I agree with the whole policy change, education from primary, secondary level. I agree with all of that. I just also would like to highlight the involvement of the disabled community. in changing that misconception. A study, I think in 2019 in the UK showed that about 47% of the people in the UK have actively avoided having to engage disabled person. And one of the reasons given by about 67% of them is fear of saying the wrong thing. How are people supposed to learn if they are even so scared of engaging with people? So, I think it's about talking within ourselves as advocates of disability to actually help disabled people see the importance of their identity and how much good can come from working together as a community to sort of take every opportunity to engage with people, correct some of these misconceptions and all of that. So I think that would go a long way in, again, together with all other means of policy, advocacy, education, to help change the misconception of disability. Again, from the aspect of the researcher, I think it's high time, we start to measure projects, by the impact as opposed to how sustainability or market value. It's about if you measure, for instance, if I come to you to say, oh, I'm applying for a grant to build a website, and one of the questions is, oh, how is this likely to impact the life of people who are visually impaired? If that is the goal, it's impossible for you to overlook the need for disability inclusion because you're measuring that based on the impact it's supposed to have, as opposed to, oh, what's your 10-year survival rate? How much are you looking to make in 5 years? So it's about putting impact at the core of what we do. The last point I'll be talking about is how do we ensure that these changes that we make are sustainable? And it's very simple. Personally, I've been involved in disability research discussion for about 3 years now, and in my own space, I would say that I've been impressed by the momentum around the discussion. I believe there's a lot of interest, genuine interest in actually making this work for major stakeholders. However, what that has led to is duplication of efforts. You would see that many organizations are spending time and money to do something that has already been solved, by another organization or even government agency. But due to the fact that they probably don't know where to look or what to build on or what the best practice is, then they have to start over from that. So I think importantly, we need to begin to signpost evidence-based best practices. There needs to be a source of, oh, I'm building a website. What is the minimum I have to do to ensure that this is accessible to persons with visual impairment or other disabilities? And, oh, this is where you look at, this is what we built on, this is what it is in the next 6 months. And we need to update that data source as regularly as possible. Again, I think as we've seen in the case of COVID-19 pandemic and the vaccine generation, I know people who have refused to take the COVID-19 vaccine just because of the speed with which it was, produced. And really, that basically was just as a result of the collaboration between industry and academic setting. Everyone brought in their best beats, which led to a very fast turnout of vaccines. So I'd like to see more participation of academic and industry partnership in ensuring disability inclusive research. What this also does is it will also go on to bridge that gap, knowledge gap of where do I need if I need to bring this? What is the current best practices? So I think that collaboration would help. And I think Yaya also mentioned this in terms of encouraging or finding a way to motivate either public or government agency to incorporate accessibility requirements in procurement policies. It should be a shame now when you build a new website and it's not accessible. So there's need for us to incorporate to advocate that is incorporated into either private bodies or government agencies, that you need to ensure accessibility requirements, before you go into partnership with anybody, before you do about contracts and all that. And now finally, I'll conclude that we need to engage. What GDI is doing, this is very good. But again, like I said earlier, building within ourselves, ensure that we provide the culture and the benefits or the positives of having disabilities, which then helps us to engage with people when we have the opportunity to ultimately change the narrative around disability. I'll stop and take happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Nadi. Also, we've got a couple of questions in the chat. I think the theme across all of the webinars we've had so far, and particularly today, is about mindset change. It's about culture change, and so that we can make disability, accessibility a mainstream discussion point. As you know, Sarah said last week, nothing about us, not nothing about us without us, it's about nothing without us, period. And Paul said that we should be part of the, you know, when the cake is being baked, not just invited later on. So we want to make sure that and we realize that a lot of the companies and organizations are making efforts to make, you know, for EDI. So, you know, looking at diversity, looking at inclusion. And some of the things that we have discussed recently are around sort of gender diversity and sort of, you know, ethnicity and race diversity as well. But unfortunately, still, as Yahya mentioned, disability is often left out because, yes, everything else is important, but also disability is equally important if we're talking about 15% of the world's population here. So definitely there needs to be a mindset change so that we can make you know, conversations about disability mainstream early on in people's lives, so that children don't have to feel uncomfortable or have different, often you know, misinformed perceptions about disability and disabled people. So we are actually having some trouble in getting our last speaker on as a panelist at the moment. I've been trying to figure this out on the sidelines, but unfortunately it seems we're having some trouble. But the good thing is that we have time for Q&A. So if anyone would like to, you know, come on speaker and would like to ask their questions verbally, please do raise your hand and I will enable you to speak. In the meantime, we have a question from Alex. Alex, would you like to ask your question yourself, or should I read it out? If you would like to ask it yourself, I can allow you to talk from the Zoom feature. Okay, I think I'm going to ask the question, but do feel free to raise your hand if you would like to add anything to it. So Alex asks, yesterday, primary pupils in Uganda started their primary leaving examinations. In a story about visually challenged pupils, supervisors were just looking on, not able to understand Braille, hence unable to support them when called upon to. If building and mainstreaming such traditional writing formats that would enhance the inclusion has not been achieved, then how possible can inclusive education and employment be expeditiously achieved through assistive technology? Don't we think that we need to first address the mindset about disability, which can then translate into desire to support inclusion in all sectors, but most importantly in this era as assistive technology? So Paul, you've raised your hand, so I'm going to come to you first. Paul, you can unmute and speak.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
My question is, it's very interesting because when you talk about accessibility not being a problem, while it's we need to make it as a culture, how do we really have those, what are the philosophy behind making it more like a culture which can be embraced by all? Because you find that at the end of the day, we've been talking accessibility, but what people think about accessibility is more of physical accessibility other than tech. Thank you very much.
Great. Paul, was that a question for one of the panelists, or would you like to address the question Alex asked?
One of the panelists, especially the first one.
Okay. Yeah. Would you like to address this question?
Yes, hi, if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'm just gonna turn on my video as well. Yeah, so when I said about this, accessibility should be a culture to be built rather than a problem to be solved, really. I think if you ask a lot of people, Paul, I think in every part of the world, in organizations, if you ask them questions, is okay to discriminate, they will categorically say, no, of course not. And it's, they will feel very shame to do so. So what we need to understand, when we need to tell them then is that when you do not consider accessibility in physical and digital, it is a form of discrimination. It's not an intentional discrimination, but it is discrimination. And with that starting, the thinking behind it is that, okay, I don't want to discriminate. My problem with accessibility is not because I don't want to do it, it's because I don't know how to do it. And I think here is where we need to put the culture into place, saying that it's something that you need to factor it from beginning, as everybody was saying. It's something that if you don't have enough expertise of how to do it, you have range of experts out there you can hire. You can have advocacy group who will give you information, and frankly have information available online. I mean, if you go to webaim.org, it's a library of digital accessibility. It's a starting point to get to know everything about accessibility or digital accessibility, especially as a free resources. So that the idea of knowledge, the gap of knowledge can be plugged easily through a combination of things, but then internally need to be understood that accessibility consideration is not something that affects people with disability only. It's a good use for everybody. When I have this Alexa speaker, for example, or any smart speaker, it's not useful for people who cannot use their hands and can, want to get information verbally, but it's just a convenient thing for everybody, like somebody just washing their dishes, etc., etc. So it needs to be put into the lens of something I'm going to be talking about next week in different talk, but it need to go into the lens of innovation, scalability, convenience, so many different things. And only through that kind of mature understanding, then accessibility becomes a culture rather than a problem to be solved.
Absolutely. Thank you, Yahya. Ben, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm coming particularly to this question about what can we do, as organizations. There's often an onus on an organization, particularly public sector bodies. I think most of the global legislation seems to zero in on the public sector body and less on the kind of commercial sector. So I think certainly in the UK, where we don't have the benefits, very sadly, of the European Accessibility Act, which I think does put some pressure on commercial suppliers. I think in many parts of the world, the only pressure on commercial suppliers, software providers, is what we put on them as customers. And I think there's a really good opportunity for us to kind of crowdsource or standardize the sorts of procurement questions that we ask as a public sector to create a kind of baseline of what our expectations are. Obviously, UCL is involved in lots of purchasing of different bits of software, and I'm very pleased to say now that the accessibility team are kind of core to reviewing those platforms to make sure that we're not buying into inaccessible platforms. But Q&A button, more button. It's all uncommon for us to get feedback from suppliers who will say, well, we're, our tools currently being used by X many government departments and other universities and, public sector bodies, and no one's ever raised this query with us before. And therefore, I think, exactly as Yahya said, it's not necessarily horrible and they don't care. It's just not something that's culturally on their radar. So I think as a community, we could do more to kind of raise that momentum. And certainly for the commercial sector, it creates that kind of business incentive, because if if we're all asking the same questions, there's no kind of hiding place. And if we're all asking the same questions, we can measure the replies and potentially even share some of those replies. We could actually have a community where we say, has anybody bought this product recently? And has anyone done any accessibility work? Because otherwise, every organization has to do its own kind of accessibility detective work. And it's so much duplication of effort when actually that should just be done centrally. Suppliers should have a really clear framework that they're answering to be able to provide really solid evidence on the accessibility of their platforms that mean public sector bodies can make really informed choices. Because I think certainly in schools, primary schools, secondary schools, further education, that they don't have the resources. They don't have highly technical accessibility teams to do some of this awareness raising and the procurement checking. So I think that's something that should happen centrally and globally, because the measures for accessibility typically, if we're talking about digital accessibility, will be the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is a really good place to start. And that's an international standard. So that means that we could actually have cross-border sharing of accessibility conformance from suppliers. And then I think very quickly suppliers would get the message, and accessibility wouldn't be a nice to have or a thing that's kind of, I mean, I had a feedback from a supplier yesterday who actually said, we've never been asked about accessibility conformance before. We're very happy to do it, but it may cost you extra. And I think in my talk last week, I said, you would never expect the same behavior from a supplier if you were talking about cybersecurity or data protection. You would just expect them to be delivered as core. And yet accessibility just seems to, at the moment, not yet have the same profile. So I think we as a sector could kind of, gather our resources collectively to create that industry pressure and momentum.
Well said, Ben. Thank you so much. I think that's exactly the point, that suppliers are not penalized or not even incentivized to build in accessibility. The pressure usually is to deliver the minimum viable product, which has those 20% features that are used 80% of the time. And because accessibility and disabled users, particularly screen reader users, are not seen as mainstream audience or mainstream users of a lot of the software that is being developed, unfortunately, accessibility is sidelined and is sort of used as an add-on, which is charged extra, which absolutely right, that we wouldn't expect that for security features, for example. I'm going to move on to Francis. Francis, sorry, I had to mute you a couple of times because Ben was still speaking. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question or add any thoughts that you might have?
Magam, just to quickly remind you that first question.
Pardon?
Just to remind you that the first question, the one you read out, I don't think has been answered. Just so you don't lose track of it.
Would you like to read out the question? Sorry, I'm not sure which one you're saying.
Oh, okay. I mean, I don't have it here. I just remember
it was Alex's questions about the incident in Uganda.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah. So yeah. Would anyone like to address that question? We might have time for one more from Francis after this. I guess what Alex is pointing to is having that cultural change, and accessibility and disability inclusion being part of the training for teachers as well. And so would anyone like to share any examples of anything that you've come across, or have any thoughts on how we can make that possible? Laddie, you're on mute. Did you want to answer?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, I can give it a go. I think I sort of understand where Alex mentioned, we're talking about accessibility when there's a lot of cultural problems. And personally, in Africa, the cultural model of disability is one of the oldest models where, there are basically three different aspects. People think, oh, if you're disabled, you have some supernatural power. Or they think, oh, if you're disabled, you're like a demigod, or God is trying to teach you some perseverance. And the worst case is they think, oh, you're disabled, you're probably under some punishment from the supernatural being, and therefore I don't want to get involved with you. So I understand how that can actually impact people and how they perceive you. So in terms of discussing accessibility, I also think if you're looking at Africa as a case study, I would say that the first place to start is education. There's significant need to actually educate people's opinion or change people's opinion or perception of disability, more so there than in the global north, for instance. So I think I sort of agree that, if you have teachers who don't even understand or who don't take the extra step to try and understand, how to use brailles and all of this assistive technology, what is the point? So I understand that. I also understand the fact that there's minimal resources where government or schools don't see the need to send a teacher for a course that costs $500 just because there's a student with visual impairment in the class. So again, it's about actually putting this and making sure that the impact of education, the impact of all that we do is the core, as opposed to how much we spend or how much we tend to pay. So I think I'll leave it at that, just for the sake of time.
Thank you so much, Ladi. Francis, do you still want to ask your question? Okay. All right, I'm going to move on to Paul. Hang on 1 second. Sorry, I'm just getting hands popped up. Okay, before I move to Paul, I'm going to let Marie ask your question. Hi, Marie.
Hi. I wanted to answer Francis's question, if I may.
Sure.
Yes, I'm speaking from South Africa. In our system, we have trained the examiners to adapt the papers up front and to make them accessible in all the various ways in which children who are visually impaired will need to answer the questions. Like if you have unnecessary pictures, how to replace them with descriptions, and the whole range of things that have been made very clear by ICV, and for which there are online courses available. So it shouldn't be so difficult for an exam system to introduce from top to bottom, right from examiners to the delivery of the exam, to have systems in place for blind learners to be able to answer their papers on Braille, or verbally if you don't have Braille machines and other equipment available. So there's so much, even in low-income countries, available to make it possible for children at primary school leaving and secondary school leaving to have a fair chance to do the exams in an accessible format. So I can get in touch with Alex if he wants to. Thanks.
That's great. Feel free to drop your email address in the chat. And Alex, yes, please do get in touch. And we understand that resources can be limited, and there is that's one of the biggest challenges. But as as it was said, that yes, it is important to look at what the existing resources are available and tap into those and see how they can be provided to children in schools or educator. Francis, you've still got your hand up, so I'm curious if you still have your questions or you want to add anything.
Hold the audio now unmuted.
Okay.
Banya here, Mariam.
Yes, Banya.
Okay, I want to quickly add something very small here in terms of inclusion and accessibility. I have realized over the time, for example, in Uganda.
This Francis speaking from Ghana.
Oh.
Okay.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead quickly, and I think Francis might want to add something still, so we'll come to Francis. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So what I have realized over the time is that people who have been consistently exposed to living with persons with disabilities are more inclusive and tend to create more accessible ways than those who have not lived with persons with disabilities. And this has been example, because when I have studied with so many people, and then when you meet them, they will tell you, oh yes, we studied with a person with visual impairment, and they will know how to give assistance. They will know how to guide you, and they know how to approach you and ask for assistance if you want to. But those who have not been exposed to persons with disabilities and have no knowledge, and are the ones who have no any kind of inclusion or accessibility, and therefore going back to what Yahya had said, inclusion and accessibility could come naturally if persons with rather if everybody is exposed to disability, if everybody learns a lot about disability, then inclusion, accessibility becomes naturally. Even suppliers start building into accessibility standards naturally because they know it's a culture and it has to not to be forgotten. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Banya. Francis, I'm going to come to you and then we'll wrap up with Paul.
Yes, good afternoon to us all. Yes, Francis, speaking from Ghana.
Yes, Francis.
Yes, good afternoon to us all.
Would you like, do you have a question?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, what I want to also add a little is as persons with disability, so far as technology is concerned, we must also encourage ourselves to also go higher as far as technology is concerned. And then my little question is, can we get the your lectures for the day, and then last week, can we get a slice note on that so that we can be reading at our own leisure period? Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm not sure if we got that question completely, and also I think the captioner struggled to get that. Francis, if you don't mind asking your question in the chat, or you can email it to me directly, and we'll see what we can do. Paul, I'll come to you quickly. We only have 3 minutes.
Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Thank you very much. What Francis was asking is about a WhatsApp group where we can share the documents for all of us. That's what I heard from him. My question or my interesting thing is about we persons with disabilities. We find that we're in a situation whereby my observation, my opinion is that a lot of many transactions, whether it is issue about accessibility, whether it's issue about different sectors, we find that our issues are normally hijacked, such that you find that our strategies of even being included, it is not well understood by those who have no disability sometimes, or even some other organizations come on board and then they take the space for us. How can we really enable ourselves to become forefront in terms of getting insight? Because we find that even in the larger disability sector movement, I can really say without fear of doubt that most of the advocacy work has been hijacked by international NGOs, not the real sense of OPDs running the show. And then we lose the meaning of meaningful participation or the meaningful of self-representation. And that's why you find that at the end of the day, we are still lagging behind. I don't know whether others have observed or it's just my own makeup of a story. And lastly, that point of us not being appreciated in terms of several instances whereby you are called upon to create these platform of whereby people take advantage by, they invite you in events, but they don't pay. If you're an artist with a disability, you are told to come, but you're not paid. If you come to give a digital talk, you're not paid. And I've seen it severally within my country and other platforms. What are other experiences of other people? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. And again, I think that this is a very, I'm sorry, did someone wanted to add?
Yeah, I could just very quickly come in. I know
Okay.
we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Paul, I've experienced what you're talking about. I used to be in the corporate world, working for 10 years, and I had nothing to do with disability in terms of my day-to-day work. And what really moved me into the accessibility inclusion consultancy in the last 3-4 years is this idea of we decide what is for you, we do things on your behalf, and etc., etc. So I think to make sure that this does not continue to happen is that we also, as a community of disability, we have responsibility to also educate ourselves into our own issues. We have responsibility to educate ourselves into the mainstream language, the mainstream issues, and to make sure that we able to bring the change by educating and elevating our standard as well in the conversation. So therefore, when we do not heard, when not represented, we're able to make the change. I remember I went to a conference 6 years ago, and a fellow person with a disability, it was about CSR, corporate social responsibility, and it was full packed agenda of many things. And she just put her hands up and she said, "You've talked about so many different things within social responsibilities, but you've not even addressed a topic of disability." And it was very embarrassing, but it really kind of made them understand. And I think subsequent conferences I've been to had agenda of disability. So sometimes we also need to speak out. And if people do not want to pay you for your time, I'm sure you can do more things interesting in your time. And I agree with you. Do not do things voluntarily for free, but make sure that you also value your own contribution and make sure that you're getting paid for it. And if they don't value you, you can go to someone else who will pay you, I think.
That's a brilliant answer. Thank you. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. Absolutely. I feel that we've touched on so many different things in today's webinar that could have a separate webinar on each of those topics. And I would love to continue, but for now we will have to wrap up. We will come back hopefully soon next year with a new series and targeting all of these different issues that have come up. If anyone would like to get involved in the project from the attendees, please feel free to drop me a line. My email address is in the Q&A, but also it's on the website, and we would love to work with you. I would like to give a special thanks to our panelists for joining us and speaking over the last few weeks and being part of the project, and to all the attendees who have consistently joined over the last 3 weeks. And hopefully we'll see you again in the new year. Thank you all for joining. Have a peaceful time. Take care. Bye.
Hold the audio now.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.